What I'm going to talk about are taxes that we pay today. And this is about tax policy, and that's where sort of the rubber hits the road as far as the work that we do. So what tax do we pay makes sense or is progressive? Progressive taxes are supposed to be good, in other words, the ability to pay. And so let's see if we can name the good tax. A sales tax is very popular. Sales taxes are most popular in the Deep South. Why? Well, I think there's a lot of subconscious or unconscious reasons that sales taxes are popular in the poor, deep, old South. And I think that the sales tax is probably the worst tax that you can impose upon a working population. It's regressive. In most of the southern states, you pay a sales tax on food, you pay a sales tax on clothing, and it is mobile. I'm going to keep coming back to that word, I'm afraid. But the mobility of the sales tax actually hurts the ability of a city to gather the funds needed to pay for schools, to pay for services and infrastructure. A good example of the problem with the sales tax of any sort is, I'm going to reference the city I work in, again, Philadelphia, but this applies to New York in particular as well. 2 years ago, there was a funding gap for the Philadelphia city schools. And the city council and the mayor hemmed and hawed and asked for aid from the state. And the state said, no way, because they don't like funding anything in a large urban place like Philadelphia. So the city raised the cigarette tax. They raised it by $2 a pack. It had already been the tax $1 a pack. So I don't like smoking. I used to smoke, but it's no good, but people will smoke. So the city of Philadelphia, the cost of a pack of cigarettes went to about $12 a pack, which is really not different, much different from New York City's total tax for a pack. I work with a town just outside the border, and I mean just outside the border of Philadelphia, and they didn't have that tax on cigarettes. And they had a bad sort of storefront area called Market Street. And within 8 months of the cigarette tax implementation, 4 tobacconists opened up in this little town just outside of Philadelphia. People now drive over. If you go to our website, urbantoolsconsult.org, I did a few essays and examples. There used to be tons of tobacconists on the Philadelphia side of the Delaware River, and they're going out of business because now people go to New Jersey to buy their cigarettes, where they used to be more expensive. Tax evasion is a crime. Tax avoidance is a sport, and every American citizen likes to play it. Now, our city knows that in New York. What do? They have a sales tax holiday every couple of years. When the kids are going back to school, they'll have a sales tax holiday. Why do they do that? Because they know that people are going to go to New Jersey, of all places, or do some internet shopping and not pay the sales tax. A carton of cigarettes right now, of Marlboros, premium stuff, costs about $110 a carton. In the state of Delaware, which is a 20-minute drive from Philadelphia, the cost is $35 a carton. So the sales tax is the most essentially mobile tax, as well as being the hardest on poor people. What if you can't get to Delaware? Same thing with a television set. You're paying, in Philadelphia, you're paying 8.5%. In the rest of the state of Pennsylvania, you're paying 6.5%. In Delaware, can anyone guess what the sales tax is? Zero. And just in case they think that you, the citizen, aren't smart enough to figure that out, when you enter Delaware, there are big signs that say, "Welcome to Delaware. home of tax-free shopping. It's a sales point. I don't like sales taxes. And the fact that they're deployed in majority poor states in the Deep South is upsetting, including New Mexico. So places that depend upon exploiting the poor love sales taxes. Now, the income tax I discussed a little earlier is very mobile indeed. We have in Philadelphia an additional income tax, a wage tax, on top of the state income tax. So very good studies have been done by a sympathizer to land value tax, Bob Inman and Susan Wachter of the University of Pennsylvania Wharton School, that essentially says 100,000 jobs were lost in Philadelphia from 1950 to now. We lost 300,000 jobs, but they marked 100,000 jobs as lost due to the wage tax. And I think a great way to explain that as far as the mobility of labor and taxing wages is another sin, like a sales tax, is that outside of Philadelphia, there's an old mill town called Conshohocken, which is where almost all the Class A office space and jobs have been established in the past 30 years instead of Philadelphia. It's a physical scar that you can see in a town like Philly. On one side of the Boston Post Road, US 1, you see Philadelphia. And it's sort of a crumbling area with a few, rent-a-centers, that kind of a thing. And you go to the corner and you cross the street into Montgomery County, directly opposite from these kind of crummy, barely hanging on stores, and you literally see a Saks Fifth Avenue and a Lord & Taylor. And there's a reason for that. And I believe it's income taxation. Now, in New York City, of course, and in Philadelphia and many other cities, business taxation is very popular. Why? Because business exploits us. They get all the money, and where are they going to go? And that's, again, a mobile source of taxation that can easily flee and does. And the flip side of that is when you grant a privilege or a monopoly to a business with subsidies and abatements to make them come into your city or stay in your city. In other words, we're going to reward you for being a business, but we're not going to reward the barbershop. We'll remember what the last Democratic governor of Illinois did, Quinn, I believe his name was. And he raised the income tax and the business corporate tax. And all the big guns in the state said, okay, we're leaving. Caterpillar in Peoria, Illinois, okay, we're leaving. And so he said, oh, don't go. We'll give you a 10-year tax abatement. Meanwhile, the increase on small sweat equity style businesses stayed the same. Just a few weeks ago, General Electric, who had been based in Connecticut for decades, decided we don't need this. That being increased labor taxes, increased business taxes, and a terrible business environment all around. And they moved to the low tax haven of Massachusetts. And who among us can guess that Massachusetts would now be called a low tax state? But for General Electric purposes, it is. And it's not that we love General Electric, but they provided jobs. They provided ancillary jobs, and they could move. Now, the real property tax, the real estate tax, which is what we're here to talk about, that's half mobile. In other words, if you don't put any investment into a building, if you just let it go and don't keep it up, it falls down. So in that sense, it's mobile. The land stays. So to recap, a sales tax is the most regressive, and an income tax is terribly regressive because it's a flat tax. A lot of people support flat taxation as the fairest way to tax. The Arthur Laffer crowds. The flat tax has been terrible for Philadelphia, and it's lucky we don't have it in New York City. And wages are mobile. That's why Texas keeps growing, Texas keeps bouncing, because they don't tax incomes. And a lot of people that would never ever have thought of moving to Texas are there right now. They've left California, they've left New York, they've left Pennsylvania, because your money goes further, your wages go further, and the jobs are there. And it's not a value judgment on Republican or Democratic policies. It's a value judgment on the decisions that our elected leaders make that are not based on the question, what we tax is just as important as how much we tax. The current property tax is a regressive tax. We've shown that because we have to do studies of cities, and we start with the property tax at all times because people are most angry at the property tax. And because they're most angry at that particular tax, we go there first, and we help. And it's regressive because it hits new and small businesses hard. You have a newer, better building. For a small business, if you're a barber, lucky if you can pay your property tax. And poor neighborhoods have sort of, I think you wouldn't, counterintuitively, poor neighborhoods have such low land value that if you do own a home in a poor neighborhood, almost all of the value that you're taxed on is in the building. If you were in Midtown and we had good assessments, your building value would be almost nothing, but your land value is very high. Same with Philadelphia. If you're in Center City, your land value is very high, so your building value is not as, in a ratio, as high as it is in poor neighborhoods. What can collecting land values do for a community? And what has happened in communities? It provides a reliable revenue stream. If you depend on a sales tax, or if you depend on income tax, or you depend on business tax, those are always, you can ask analysts from the left and the right, those are the first tax revenue streams to collapse during bad times. The property tax usually is very slow in catching up to the collapse. We're talking about a period over 5 or 10 years. And as we discussed, the rest of these taxes that we're collecting are bad for a local or regional economy. Collecting revenue from land values, or economic rent, if we're able to arrive at that day, I hope, in my life, it's an alternative to taxes on work, investment, commerce, and savings. In other words, the Jane Jacobs, the life of the city. If we can keep those things that keep the city going, then we're going to have a healthier city. I believe that land values can help us reward development, private development, market development, without some authority or without some government kicking in a subsidy or an abatement. The number of people that are subsidized in this city or all across the country is not very great, but they're subsidized if they're connected. In other words, it's the classic use of monopoly privilege. And another way, and I'm going to go in this in the next talk, is how can you collect land values in an efficient way, or in a way that a community might want? The whole municipality can do it. That's where it works in Pennsylvania mostly. Or it can be in a targeted tax district. For example, the city of Pittsburgh has a land value tax only in the downtown area. You can have effective pilots. What is a pilot? It's a payment in lieu of taxes. And payment in lieu of taxes is vital for a city like New York, or a city anywhere. Imagine Boston. Boston has almost 60% of its land value exempt off the tax rolls because of the universities, because of the hospitals, because of the many historical museums and sites. So there's so little for the city to collect because these are tax exempt that cities have enacted a program called payment in lieu of taxes. But the eds and meds, as sort of the policy shorthand for hospitals and schools and so on, they'll say, but we have a charitable purpose on our building. And so what we do with a land value coming from exempt land is we say, we'll let you do your charitable purpose by having the building tax exempt, but pay your fair share. Pay your user fee for the land that you're using that benefits you. If the University of Pennsylvania or Columbia, or when I lived in the Lower East Side, when New York University, if they had known they were going to pay taxes, at least on their land, they wouldn't have gobbled up so much land in these distinct areas and driving out people. The Battle of Morningside Heights, where Columbia tried to essentially elbow out the neighborhood and succeeded. Finally, land values can be used as a source for transportation funding. And that's very important right now everywhere, but more so in New York City because the MTA is broke. Again, it's always broke. Land value capture based upon the transportation infrastructure provided can bring in billions of dollars. The Second Avenue subway, when it's finished, is going to be a nice benefit for the citizens of New York. But who really benefits? The invisible user. In other words, some person that owns a valuable storefront that goes up 10 stories next to a new subway stop, that owner might live in Tokyo for all we know, but that's the invisible user. And that's the invisible beneficiary of transportation infrastructure funding. They ought to pay for it because the only thing that they're going to get rich on are their land values. Land values will skyrocket. It's been proven over and over again. And it's a shame, and it violates, I think, our sense of good justice. It's a shame that people are asked to pay out of their pockets more than the ultimate beneficiaries of this infrastructure. Lest we forget, the early subways in New York City were privately paid for by smart guys like August Belmont, who bought the land and then built the subway and sold the land. Clever, simple, and it's been repeated over and over. So essentially, I'm going to wind down this little section about what we think collecting land values can do. And we'll take a little break and we'll get back into it in a few minutes. Do we have a discussion?
Yeah, one question is that before, like, land values are created after the investment. In other words, if you had the land value tax ahead of the investment wouldn't happen. In other words, if you didn't know that you would rake, let's say, good revenues from, let's say, the second subway, then you wouldn't develop there. So don't you think that that's a little bit kind of like a red herring?
I actually don't, because what you're doing by opening the Second Avenue subway, you're opening new revenue streams that did not exist before. Yes, people they've built there. I agree with you. But once the subway is there, it changes the whole stream, the unseen stream of economic rent that goes down that subway line. Its public investment is going to make those areas much, much richer, quantifiably so. We can recall not 10 years ago when the Jubilee line was extended in London on the Underground. And as an experiment, Transport for London announced the route at a press conference. And I don't have the numbers in front of me, but we can look it up. I can maybe even bring it in tomorrow. They announced the route, and almost overnight, land values asking land values went up 8 times. And it was a fib. That wasn't going to be the route at all. All they had to do was make an announcement. One press conference made economic rent stream through this benighted part of East London. I really predict that on the 2nd Avenue subway is going to be going from wilderness, if you will, to the center of the margin of utility.
No, I agree.
Yeah.
So I agree that land values are going to be created. I do agree that that property values are going to go up there. I do agree, but that's ex post facto. So the whole point is, if you want to raise the capital, quote unquote, or the money, I shouldn't say that. If you want to raise the capital to fund an infrastructure project, somebody needs to cough up that money up front.
Yes.
So you are suggesting basically that the city or the state together, or the public authorities, whichever those may be, could be the federal government, should pony up the money up front, and then with the land value tax,
Collect it back.
So that system sounds reasonable. And do you know if that's been practiced, and this is what you're advocating? Because I find it hard that private investment is going to work according to that scheme, because then it would be zero sum for them. They put it up front, but then you don't allow them to collect in the long run. So they will say, okay, well, why should I do that? That's not profitable for me. So do you really see that this stratagem will make government the chief investor in public infrastructure?
That's how it's turned out, as we all know. Government is the chief investor for infrastructure. It doesn't have to be so. I'll give you an example of where it worked. In the 1890s in Washington, D.C., all of the streets, just about all of the streets, were mud. They were dirt streets. Washington, D.C. was a lousy place to live for many years. And the business community hated it because at that time it was horses and buggies. So imagine mud, merde, en français. Imagine all of that gathering together on the street. And the business owners wanted relief because business was bad and people were sick. So the Congress at the time ran Washington, D.C., the U.S. Congress, and they authorized something close to a land value tax. They authorized a per front foot charge, line foot charge on the street front. So if you owned the Willard Hotel, you would pay a lot. If you owned a small shop, you would pay a little. But to pave the streets, the business owners had to kick in the money. And the business owners, well, they couldn't say no because the government had dictatorial powers. But the business model, and this is what I think you're getting to, their business model could work if they paid the funds to pave the street, and then they figured out how much more business would improve. This is in the 1890s. And how much higher they could build. This was just as elevators were coming in too. So in that sense, it's been done. I mean, what we're doing with the 2nd Avenue subways is interesting because the great age of subway building pretty much ended in 1930. So we're really sort of rebuilding the wheel, and we can't use, because nobody can use the market anymore in New York City. It's too controlled. It's very difficult. So you do need the taxpayers probably to chip in, but you can recoup that. And for the MTA, most especially, I think you can recoup annual maintenance costs from the increased land values surrounding stops and surrounding the businesses that most benefit. And that also includes bus lines. It also includes Metro North. I always find it ironic that Metro North, in the richest state in the Union, Connecticut, has been broke since 1958, continually. So something does not compute. It's a rich state, yet the money is disappearing for public purposes. And that's what I guess I would say I was concerned about.